you want to stop China from doing nasty things to you, you need to have nuclear weapons. Second, if you can't make your own nuclear weapons, get the American umbrella, nuclear umbrella, to secure you against a very gigantic, powerful neighbor.
This week's column, Raja Mandala, you've looked at the nuclear fallout, so to speak, of Russia's aggression. For the first time in a long time, they've actively threatened nuclear deterrence, let's call it. The Russian foreign minister, a fairly senior person in government, this is not coming from, a non-state actor. One of the first, what we talk about Asia, particularly in the piece, but I'd like to ask you first, you also mentioned Europe. You'd written recently about Germany as well. You're seeing Germany for the first time since the Second World War actually talk about arming itself once again, not perhaps in a nuclear sense, but certainly in terms of conventional weapons and with its manufacturing prowess. France is a nuclear power, which was a sort of non-NATO country. We're also looking at France, Germany, happy. How do you see this? The sort of global consensus, do you think, the globalization consensus post the Cold War, where you'd seen Europe turning away from geopolitics to an extent? It was integration, trade. The EU is not a political bloc, for example. It's not a military alliance. It's not seen that way. It's seen as a trading partnership, as a place for an open economy. Do you think that common sense is now shifted, at least for the near future?
No, there's no question that geopolitics is back. I mean, it was widely assumed that, go back to the end of the Cold War, this whole idea of history has come to an end, that liberal democracy and capitalism have triumphed. And it's really a minor detail of how everybody adapts to it. So I think we've come a long way from that. And in this case, I would say it has really woken up Europe from a prolonged geopolitical holiday. That is, Europe was so focused on integration post-90 that it was really putting itself together. The Americans were seen as taking care of security. Russia was seen as down and out, so they were not really seen as a threat. And China was a huge business opportunity. So Europe had nothing to do but do business, talk about values once in a while, and talk about norms. But I think Russia has shattered that complacence, both the idea that that you can just simply take Russia for granted, or that you don't have to worry about Russia, to actually believing that you don't have to bother about military, defense, security. All these are really passé. That Europe had transcended the phase of 19th century. I mean, it was now entered the phase of post geopolitical world. While the rest of Asia, these guys were suffering from 19th century, ideas about territory, conflict. Europe had transcended all these, and that they had discovered the secrets of perpetual peace. That illusion, I think, has been shattered. They now have to deal with the fact that there can be war in Europe, a brutal war. I mean, it's one thing to see mayhem in the cities of Asia, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, but to see it in a European city, it's actually quite shocking for them, because this is not something they prepared for, nor did they expect it. But I think that is now over. German rearmament promised to do that, 100 billion euros. That's almost $130 billion to be spent this year, and Europe is going to spend more on defense. So I think Europe is now come together. It's going to pool their resources to cope with the China challenge, as well as they're also now beginning to focus. China is more than a market. China is a geopolitical actor, and they have to deal with the Chinese ambitions as well.
So the second thing now, you could talk in your piece quite a bit. Everyone should read it. It's on the indianexpress.com. It's a very interesting read. You should be able to also find the link wherever you're watching this video in the description. So, we talk about, say, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. All three, South Korea with North Korea, of course, with China's backing to some extent. Taiwan, there's been a sort of fear now that, or it's in the ether that this is China's going to now go. Taiwan is strategically significant, particularly for the technology industry. It holds half the reserves, I think, of minerals and chips that we need now for almost every kind of computing. and that kind of, if say South Korea arms itself, and that US being the security guarantor, it is no longer the US of the 20th century, this new US you may have to take. Do you see this as a development which is now going to have a cascading effect in terms of where priority shifts? Say South Korea is an economic powerhouse, but perhaps not necessarily a military one. The disarmament, which had become a sort of consensus, there was the shadow of nuclear war, was not something any one of us has seen, say, in my lifetime. I mean, in the last 30, 35 years, except for briefly during post-Pokhran. It's not something we've discussed. Do you see that fundamentally in terms of resources and mind space, that conversation shifting in our neighborhood as well, near and far?
Yeah, absolutely. In Asia, I think what does Asia learn from Ukraine? That Ukraine has been left to its own devices. That because it's not a member of NATO, the Americans are not going to defend it. Europe is not going to defend it against Soviet Russia, because NATO and Europe decided quite early on they're not going to fight Russia on Russia's borders. So it'll be too expensive. And I think that's what, so that's why Putin's threat to use nuclear weapons or put the nuclear weapons on high alert did not make a difference, because they were not going to fight. It's whatever they do in Ukraine is indirect. They're not going to directly fight Russia. And Putin also knows, look, there are too many nuclear powers in Europe. So he was not really threatening them. He was basically saying, if you try to mess with me in Ukraine, I can escalate it. And then you have a problem. But Europe is not getting into Ukraine. They're not fighting in Ukraine. They're supporting Ukraine, but they're not getting into the Ukraine. But if you're in Asia, what are the two lessons you draw? Either you have a solid alliance commitment. That is, there must be somebody strong to protect you from your neighbor, or you have nuclear weapons. That is, if you have nuclear weapons historically, deter a stronger adversary. So most people say, look, if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, would Russia have dared to intervene in Ukraine? Yeah. After all, Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons in 1994, saying, look, we are, we want security guarantees and we give up nuclear weapons. It's not worked. So I think those of us who are next to China, of course, India is nuclear weapon power. We don't have the debate. But for Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, they're wondering, if China is going to do something similar, what are the options do you have? Unlike India, they're all in the US alliance system. So one, they're all trying to strengthen the alliance with the United States. Because for them, you need a stronger power to cope with the Chinese challenge. So that they're doing, all of them. And second, they're doing is, what are the options on the nuclear front? This is where Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, when he said, look, it's not just US alliance, but you need to have US nuclear weapons to prevent Chinese from doing anything funny. So they're saying, look, let's host nuclear weapons. He's suggesting, of course, it's not easy because Japan has strong nuclear allergy. So he's raising an issue which is, a priori, you would think it is impossible in Japan, but they're beginning to do it. South Korea too wants to do the same thing. Australia has already got nuclear submarines. So I think the nuclear factor is coming into the security calculus of China's neighbors, who fear China might do the same thing as what Russia has done in Europe.
So do you see, so two related questions finally. One is that back in the day, now it's in 98 when we did the test, India's objection had always been as a sort of larger philosophical point to the CTBT and the NPT, was that there is a hypocrisy here. Is that if as nation states we should have the right to defend ourselves, and if nuclear weapons you have the technology, we're responsible. It is not as though one power is more. I mean, they always say US is the only one who's ever actually attacked another country, after all, with nuclear weapons. Do you think that the disarmament, the protocol was that the US and Russia, by the dint of Soviet history, were sort of allowed to be responsible so-called nuclear powers, while everyone else was seen as, you either had to have a US-based, but independent development of nuclear weapons for strategic deterrence was heavily discouraged by the so-called superpowers. Do you think they have that same kind of conversation will carry weight now, given that China is in the neighborhood for so many of us in Asia?
I think the countries we are talking about, look, the moral argument was a very peculiarly Indian one. That because you didn't want to sign the NPT, and say, give up nuclear option. Then you went into this great argument about discrimination, hypocrisy, haves, have-nots. Look, the world operates on those, world is unequal, world is unfair. But most other Asian countries, most European countries accepted the NPT.
Yeah.
That they said, look, it's fine with us as long as Americans protect us.
Yeah.
This is okay. So finally, the question was security and protection. It's only India we debated this in moral terms. But for others, they voluntarily gave up nuclear option and relying on the United States to defend them. But today, the problem for them is the American umbrella credible under the present circumstances? What was designed against Russia in the Cold War, will it work against China, which is far more powerful, far more interconnected economically? So therefore, they're saying to one, all of them are already strengthening the military alliance with the United States. Right. So that you have the US guarantees consolidated, solidified. Second part they're doing is that let's have American nuclear weapons on Japanese soil. That is a proposition. Right. That is, if you put American weapons, then America is even more committed to defending a potential invasion of Japan, by China. So therefore, it is a way of actually proving American umbrella over Japan and Korea. But Taiwan doesn't have that option, so it's not going to be. So what they're trying to do is there something via media in between? Develop a nuclear submarine, which is what AUKUS, we had so much debate about it, is also about that you develop capabilities that are strong enough to deter Chinese, not directly nuclear weapons, but nuclear related. Yeah. This includes missiles, long-range missiles with powerful weapons, hypersonic missiles, a whole lot of things. So what we're entering is a period where people recognize the value of nuclear weapons. Yeah. That is, if you want to stop China from doing nasty things to you, you need to have nuclear weapons. Second, if you can't make your own nuclear weapons, get the American nuclear umbrella, to secure you against a very gigantic, powerful neighbor.
So, finally, a little sort of filmy question, but, there is and also devil's advocate. Like the Cuban Missile Crisis was Russia, I think it was first in Turkey, NATO base in Turkey, nuclear base, then the embargo in Cuba. Now, the Russian argument, so to speak, was that we cannot allow NATO at our door further. You've gone from 16 to 31, and Ukraine, if you become a part of NATO. Do you think that old sort of peacenik argument that this may end up becoming a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy? Is that you imagine Chinese aggression, you try to build you then invite it. You invite a belligerence from both sides, as you did in the Cold War, by presuming the worst, in the sense of, because Russia has invaded, China will invade. To deter China, we must have weapons. And that in turn sort of feeds Chinese anxieties about its neighbors arming themselves against it.
No, I think the Russian argument is problematic at one level, because to compare what Russia has done, NATO is at my doorstep, NATO is at my doorstep. My neighbors have no right to join any other alliance. I have a right to tell them what to do. Imagine me telling that to Nepal or Pakistan or to Sri Lanka, anybody. I'll tell you what is good for you, because what is bad for me, you can't do it. I mean, this is, Soviet Union could get away with it, but Russia can't. So India can't get away with it. Cuba, Americans couldn't, stop Cuba from being close to the Russians. So this idea, because my security is threatened, my neighbors' options must be limited, which is what Russia is saying. But look at what the Chinese did in Asia. In fact, Russians and Americans have not really fought. Well, China fought Americans in Korea, the so-called Korean War, 1950 to 53. Thousands of Chinese soldiers died. But later, Mao Zedong cut a deal with Nixon 50 years ago. And then Deng Xiaoping comes and says, let's draw American money and build ourselves up. So here is, American troops have sat on Japan, Taiwan, Korean Peninsula, Vietnam, Philippines, all through Southeast Asia since 1949. Some of them have gone, some of them are there. And Chinese didn't say, I'm going to pick a fight with you. And Chinese seduced American capital, if you will, became strong, and now are challenging America, saying, look, okay, now enough, you get lost from here. But Russians are saying, no, you have no business. You can't come here. If you come here, I'm going to do nasty things. I think the difference between Russian approach, which is muscular, I'm entitled, therefore I'll fight you. The Chinese, who actually won, the Wall Street is with them, the Silicon Valley with them, the American capital likes to work with China.
Yeah.
So they played it differently. So I think this idea you have entitled somehow that your neighbors have no options. I think in the real world, I have sympathy with the Russian argument. Look, many in the West have criticized NATO expansion, but you deal with the life you get. You can't say, why are the Russian neighbors upset? You talk to the Poles, you talk to the Balts, you talk to the Swedes. They all fear Russia. Many of them hate Russia. When you have a large neighbor who is capable of bullying you, and Russia does bully them, so these guys are genuinely scared. So they say, we must get the other guy to support me. So I think the Russian case, it's you have to manage these kind of situations. I mean, India can't tell Pakistan. Pakistan has strong alliance, used to have strong alliance, major non-NATO ally of the United States. It's also an ally of Pakistan, China, all-weather friend. So are we going to tell the Pakistanis? I mean, you have no business. Or we tell the Nepalese, you can't have Belt and Road, therefore I'll fix you. So I think it doesn't work. Life is unfair. Now, question is, are you clever enough to manage the unfairness of the world? By merely complaining, take out your talwar and, start swinging it around, you will get hurt.
Hey, sir. Thanks so much. I think Ukraine will be on our minds for a while now. Let's hope it gets sorted out. Everyone, read the article. It's in the IndianExpress.com. And thank you, sir. We'll see you next week.